I've lived a long time, but I do not remember an election like the one we just had. I know there have been presidential election crises. I know the story of John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. I know the story of Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. I mean, I know all these stories, but they were even before my time. I don't have any recollection of any of these events, nor did I have relatives who remembered any of these elections. So this past election has been so extraordinary. I was glued to newspaper accounts, to television accounts, to radio accounts. I don't think I was alone in that. There were millions and millions of Americans, and many of the people here in this very room who found themselves almost compellingly or compulsively attached to the media, waiting for what the outcome would be. It was unprecedented in terms of our own lifetime. An election where you didn't know who the president was going to be for over a month. An election in which the courts of the United States were intimately involved. Not just the electorate, the courts. An election in which the final decision was made by the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Didn't they ultimately make the, for all practical purposes, the final decision with a one-vote division majority? In fact, many of us are still exhausted from the election. I mean, it was exhausting. Many of us needed to get away to recover from the tension of it. It was an interesting election. The candidates were on the whole lackluster, but the process was compelling. Is that interesting? I mean, the candidates were yawn. And the process, though, was overwhelming in terms of taking up our energies and our interests. After all, the presidency of the United States of America is the most powerful job in the entire world. Now, the consequences of the election after over a month is that we have a Republican president. His name is George W. Bush. And sometimes people who know him well call him W. I don't know. But he is the president of this country, and whether we voted for him or did not vote for him, whether we like him or do not like him, whether we approve of him or do not approve of him, he is the president of this country, and he will be making decisions as the manager of this country for the next 4 years, and those decisions will affect not only the United States of America, they will affect the whole world, because America is the hegemonic power in the world. We have a Congress, a federal and national Congress, which is almost evenly divided. There's only a 7-vote difference in the House of Representatives between the Republican majority and the Democratic minority, so to call it a Democratic minority is what? Not easy. The Senate? Tied. And the only reason why the Republicans have control is because, obviously, the Vice President of the United States of America is the President of the Senate. Very few times in American history, I mean, who can remember, has the division in both the House of Representatives and the Senate been so close. One of the consequences of the election was that a third party that had emerged with great power in the 1990s, led by Ross Perot, the Reform Party, is gone. And now I'm going to mention a name that will make many Democrats ill. A new party has emerged, not very powerful. It didn't make the 5% mark that was necessary to receive funding in the next election, but it's there, and it has loyal constituents. The Reform Party is what? Through. over. You can call it the Green Party, if you will, and the name I will say softly. So some of my friends, if I say it too loud, they go, is Ralph Nader. And one of the consequences, of course, is that the Clintons will be with us forever. I mean, the election did produce a star, a Democratic star. In fact, if you look at the media, they spend more time talking about her than talking about W. Even the people who hate her can't stop talking about her. She's obviously assumed to be a figure who will be of political importance in the next 4 to 8 years, if not more. And her name is Hillary Clinton. Now, I want to ask a question. Given what we lived through and experienced in the past year, and in particular in the last month of the year 2000, or the last 2 months of the year 2000, what have we learned? I mean, history has no meaning to us unless we learn from it. What have we learned? Well, the first thing we learned about something called the Electoral College. Oh. Most of us were dimly aware that it existed. It never occurred to us that the President of the United States was not elected directly by the people of the United States of America. We simply assumed that what? It was a popular vote and the majority wins, and in fact, in almost every election we ever experienced, that was what? That was true. But that isn't true. What we know is that we have a Constitution which was designed by the Founding Fathers who lived before we had the full notion of democracy, and who placed the election of the President of the United States in the hands of electors chosen by their state legislatures. And so now we're very much aware of it. We have to confront the system. It is possible in this country for a person to win the majority of the popular vote or the plurality in the popular vote and to lose the election. In the end, what you need is a majority of the electors. And in fact, there's going to be, and I know, for the next umpteen years, attempts to amend the Constitution of the United States. One of the things we have learned is that the Supreme Court of the United States, which we assumed was sublimely above all partisanship, is as partisan as any other institution. I must tell you, I was not surprised. Courts never operate what we would call politically impartially. That is, in the end, the way you interpret the law is determined by your political philosophy of life. It is unavoidable. And the way the decision that was made in the Supreme Court of the United States of America was made was in accordance with the political predilections of the people who were chosen for the court. And so it's very, very clear that the Supreme Court is a vehicle of politics. Now, Democrats now are angry at the Supreme Court. You see. But there was a time when the roles were reversed, when the Republicans were screaming about the Warren Court. Do you remember the Warren Court? Oh. And the Warren Court saw fit to issue decrees and interpretations of the Constitution that were deeply offensive to people who were conservative. There was no doubt that the members of the court spoke from a liberal political agenda. Did I object to that liberal political agenda? No. But was I good-humored enough to recognize that it existed? The answer is yes. Divorcing the court most likely from partisan politics or political ideology is an illusion. And that was demonstrated by what happened during the election. The people who complain are always the people who lose. The third is that our voting system is flawed. I mean, today, all the jokes, the comedians have had a heyday with punch ballots. And people are now, there's a new exercise program in Florida where senior citizens push. No, they have them pushing hard to make sure it goes through the paper. No. They don't want to lose their vote. I mean, we only focused on Florida. Those punch ballots and other defective type ballots were used all over the country. Do you understand how many hundreds of thousands of votes have been lost and never counted because the ballot system, the balloting and the voting system is imperfect? And in fact, wasn't that demonstrated? If anything will come out of this election, and it most likely would serve the welfare of both Democrats and Republicans, something has to be done about the way the balloting is done in this age of modern technology. To use punch ballots is absolutely what? Yeah, it's ridiculous. The fourth is that the election demonstrated the incredible change that has occurred in this country over the last 40 years. The centers of the two major political parties have shifted in a very dramatic way. If you look at the places where George Bush won, where the Republican Party won, you're looking now at the South and the West. Well, at the end of the 19th century, the South and the West were the centers of the Democratic Party. And when I say the West, I don't mean the far West. I don't mean the California coast. I mean Montana, Utah, Wyoming, that West. If you look at the map, it's very clear that what used to be the center of the Democratic Party is now the center of the Republican Party. And the center of the Republican Party, other than in some of the big cities filled with ethnics, the center of the Republican Party always lay in New England, and certainly to some degree in the middle states, in particular states like Pennsylvania, or in the Midwest, in Ohio and Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin. Well, you look at the election map, and you can see that now the center of Democratic votes is precisely in the area where Republicans used to be the strongest. Everything has been turned over, and this election dramatically demonstrated that. One of the things we've learned is, and it was apparent from the election, is that parties ideologically are much more uniform. When I grew up with a Democratic Party that was deeply divided between liberals, the ones who supported the New Deal and Roosevelt, who even loved Eleanor, and the people who lived in the South, those representatives and the senators who hated Eleanor Roosevelt and who hated most of the principles of the liberal establishment that the New Deal put in power. Remember, the Democratic Party was deeply divided. And one of the reasons why a Republican president could always govern with a Democratic Congress was he could always get at least 1/3 of the Democrats in Congress to move over to the Republican side because they were deeply conservative. They were only Democratic because of the Civil War. Now, that problem, if it's a problem, has been partially or almost totally resolved. The South has gone Republican. And today, within each party, there is much more ideological conformity. That is, the deeply prejudiced Southern conservatives who were so much a part of the Democratic Party are what? They're no longer there. And in fact, you can more easily put the label liberal on the Democratic Party, and you can more easily put the label conservative on the Republican Party. The old mixing is less there. Obviously, there are moderate liberals and extremist liberals. There are moderate conservatives, and there are what? Extremist conservatives. But it's a very interesting kind of realignment in terms of the political structures in America. What we've learned, obviously, is also that there's a lot of ethnic voting in this country. And in fact, it was very clear that certain ethnic groups favored certain candidates. If you look at the map, the areas of the country which went Democratic, which was New England, the Northeast, and the West Coast, those areas were and also parts of the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, the Pittsburgh, that whole complex, industrial complex, is the part of America where the population is least Anglo-Saxon and most ethnic. And the part of the population, or the areas of the country, that went mainly Republican were the ones that represented the old Anglo-Saxon people or ethnic group that constituted the foundation of the United States of America. Now, we know that blacks overwhelmingly what? The statistics show it. Voted for Gore. Jews overwhelmingly voted for Gore. I mean, you can just go down the list. Hispanics were more divided, interestingly enough. And when I talk about the future and the meaning of this election, I'll talk a little bit about that. One of the constituencies the Republicans cultivated, including George Bush in Texas, are the Hispanics, and there's a great hostility between the Hispanic communities and the black communities in many cases. And the overwhelming majority of Hispanics voted Democratic, but there was a substantial number of Hispanics who voted Republican. So what we have in this country, and it's very important to remember, and we learn that time after time, that people do not always vote their economic agenda. They sometimes vote what they consider to be their ethnic agenda. So you can find in the Republican Party poor farmers from Montana, do you understand? And rich bankers from New York. They don't share an economic agenda at all, but they share a what? They may share an ethnic agenda. And you may find rich entrepreneurs from Hollywood and people who came out of the labor movement somewhere in central New York, and they're what? They're both voting the Democratic Party. One of the things we learned from this election was the power of the religious right. Now, I want to assure you that had the religious right turned to the man who most clearly articulated their point of view, the Republicans would have lost. They wouldn't give him the time of day. They wouldn't give him a podium to talk from. His name was Pat Buchanan, and he was trying to organize a third party or a fourth party. And he said all the things the religious right believed in and believes in. But they knew that if they gave Pat Buchanan an opportunity to siphon votes away from George Bush, Bush would have lost. They shut him out completely. The Democrats were not so fortunate, were they? In fact, somebody came in, it's very, very clear. If it were not for Ralph Nader, Al Gore would now be the President of the United States of America. I speak this, I mean, the statistics are there. The number of people in Florida alone who voted for Nader, right? Did we learn that? So the discipline on the right was much stronger than the discipline on the left. And in fact, the religious right kept Buchanan basically out of the election. And he was perhaps the most charismatic and the most articulate and the most intelligent of all the candidates, although I despise what he stands for. You have to acknowledge talent when you see talent. What have we learned? Well, certain areas of the country are becoming increasingly more important. The crucial state is Florida. When I grew up, before World War II, I didn't even know people who went to Florida. I mean, you know, you went to Port Huron? I don't know where you went. I mean, you know what I mean? Who went to Florida? So, and it was the down south somewhere, and they didn't have any political power anyway. Well, it's very clear there is a great population shift going on now. In areas which had been empty, Arizona, even Southern California, I mean, Florida, all these places are filling up with people. And the census was taken in the year 2000. And one of the things that's going to be happening now is, again, the redistricting. It's quite possible Michigan will lose another representative because we're not growing fast enough. And in fact, places like Florida and California and Arizona and Texas, all these places will get more representatives, more electors. One of the things we've learned is that there's nothing like a good economy. I think it was a good thing for Gore that the good economy lasted until after the the election. I mean, given all the scandals of the Democratic administration and despite all the charisma of Bill Clinton, it's very clear that an economy in decline would have given the Republicans a clear majority. One of the things that Gore could claim and talk about was how good the economy was. And the history of elections is that most people do not repudiate governments which provide for good economies. One of the things we've learned is that principles are adjustable. I've learned, certainly by watching politics, is that first you determine what your vested interest is, and then you find the principle that supports it. For years and years, the Republican Party denounced the intervention of the Supreme Court. Do you remember? Denounced the intervention of the Supreme Court. And now, in this election, they couldn't wait to get the results out of the courts of Florida into the Supreme Court, where they knew they had not a comfortable, but at least they had a majority to support their cause. So what happens is we tend to love, it takes a lot of self-discipline not to do that. We tend to love what serves our vested interest, and then we find the fancy principle that will settle it and justify it. One of the realities of this election is that the election was awash in soft money. With all the discussions about campaign reform, both the Republicans and the Democrats were rushing to what? To all the people who were giving money that they say they would really like to dispense with. In the end, both the Republicans and the Democrats, no matter what they choose to do about campaign reform, it doesn't make any difference. Both of them both parties chose to use all that money that has been on the whole roundly denounced. One of the things we've learned from the election, I have alluded to it, is that you don't need exciting candidates to have an exciting election. I mean, the prediction for the election was boredomsville. And in fact, had the election only been about the two of them talking to each other, who would have watched television? It's an interesting commentary on American politics, that in a country in which there are so many brilliant and charismatic persons, do you understand, men and women, that we often end up with such people representing the major political parties. One of the things we've learned is that in the end, both candidates, and there are differences, and I will get to the differences, both candidates were basically in the center. If they were not in the center, neither of them would have been able to get the votes that he got. That is, Bush may have showed up at some kind of religious right bigotry meeting in South Carolina, in that school, Bob Jones University, but in the end, if you listen to him in the debates or anywhere else, he was what? He was pretty much there, you know, ethnic diverse. He's pretty much there in the center. And also, even if you use the word compassionate conservatism. And the same thing for Gore. The reason why America works, and I want to repeat it, we learn it election after election, and it's one of the things which should be reassuring to us. One of the reasons why America works is that America, unlike many other countries in the world, is not divided between extreme parties. That on the whole, the two major political parties function in the center. That's why they're able to shake hands, if they can, at the end. You can't shake hands if your candidate, your opposing candidate, is miles away. That's why America works. One thing we have learned, and it's so different from my childhood, is the importance of religious vocabulary in elections. Have you ever heard so much religious vocabulary? Gore's a born-again Christian. Bush is a born-again Christian. Lieberman can't stop talking about religion. I mean, they're all of us. God is one of the major candidates in the election. It was very interesting. Most likely, 100 years ago, the American people on the whole were far more religious than they are now. But the vocabulary of politics was what? Less so. Now, for whatever reason, the people are more secular, but the what? The vocabulary is more religious, and part of it has to do with the extraordinary power vested in a minority. And that is the religious right. That is, there they are, and in fact, whatever you do as a candidate cannot in the end totally violate what they regard as important. And what we've seen in this election is the growing power of ethnics and women. The number of women governors who are now governors of the states in the United States of America, the increase of the number of women in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. I mean, dramatic elections, just Debbie Stabenow and Hillary Clinton and whatever else, all right? And the growing presence of ethnics. I mean, I'm going to be talking about the appointments of George Bush to his cabinet. It is very clear that in America you cannot govern anymore if you wish to create a cabinet composed only of Anglo-Saxon males. Impossible. Over. Finished. And the other thing we've learned, and obviously to the glee of Republicans and to the chagrin of Democrats, but it's all right. The system works. The bitterness was what? Intense. Well, after all the screaming and the crying, what? We have a new, we got a new president, and you can either love him or hate him. But the system works. It would be a terrible system where if somebody lost, what followed was a revolution. Now, during the election, it was very clear that there were certain agreements between the two parties and between the two candidates. One, there's a general agreement in America that the United States of America is the greatest power in the entire world, the greatest nation in the whole world, and that we have the right to manage the world. Both parties agree. The one issue where there was great agreement, they disagreed on the amounts of money, but on the importance of it in the agenda, everybody's agreed. Remember that? Education. You listen to Bush, if you listen to Gore, it didn't make any difference. How you were going to arrange to improve the system was an area of disagreement. But the focus on education as a major issue for the future of the United States of America was certainly there. One of the agreements, and that is certainly a result of what happened with the Democratic National Council and the arrival of Bill Clinton to the leadership in the Democratic Party and the orienting of the Democratic Party to the right, is there's general agreement that there needs to be some kind of welfare reform, that in fact the welfare reforms that took place over the last 15 years or 10 years in the United States of America, that on the whole, they're okay. And in fact, both the Clintonian Democrats and the Republicans seem to agree on that. One of the things there was wide disagreement on, not within the Democratic Party or within the Republican Party, but wide disagreement between the leaderships of both parties and between Bush and Gore was free trade. Globalization, right? Both in favor of it. Buchanan hated globalization. Nader hates globalization. But Bush and Gore, what? Favor free trade, globalization, that's a good process. Obviously, there are kinks in the whole procedure, but they can be ironed out. And the last thing, which of course was almost ludicrous, was that both of them said we're in favor of campaign, remember that? Campaign reform. Get that soft money out of the election. Perhaps the only man who was serious about it lost his chance to become the candidate for the Republican Party for the presidency of the United States, and his name was McCain. Now, but there were serious disagreements, and of course, they become the foundation of trying to figure out where we're going. One was the disagreement on defense. The proposal that was made and partially approved by the Clinton administration, but not enthusiastically, for an anti-missile system, missile system, to intercept all those missiles coming from where? Well, the communists are gone. Well, but they're Saddam Hussein. They're the crazy people in North Korea. Who knows? And to invest millions, billions, billions, and billions of dollars in the creation of this anti-missile system. And that became a matter of controversy because Bush was very much in favor of it and Gore was lukewarm. We need to study it more. One of the issues had to do with policing. And that's relevant to what's going to happen in the Bush administration. The Clinton administration arranged to send American soldiers out to various parts of the world, including Bosnia and Kosovo and Haiti and who knows what, in policing operations to maintain world order. And Bush expressed reservation about sending American troops all over the world. How are we going to handle it? How are we going to pay for it? What does it have to do with protecting American vested interests? One of the disagreements has to do with religion in public life. Bush very clearly said in the election, and this is going to be one of the tests of the administration, that he would like to see welfare services privatized, that is paid for by the government, but what? Managed by private organizations, and the ones he trusts the most are religious organizations. Oh. Again, there is always the issue about the presence of prayer and the Ten Commandments and religious values in the public schools, and certainly Bush has expressed a greater preference for that over Gore. Closely related is the whole issue of vouchers. Now, the voucher issue was defeated in initiatives in the states where it was voted on, including the state of Michigan. Pretty overwhelmingly defeated. But Bush, and here's a disagreement on the funding of education, we're both in favor of improving education. But Bush says one of the best ways to do it is not to give the public schools a monopoly, especially in the areas where they have failed, namely in the inner cities. And the way we prevent that monopoly is to give federal money to parents to send their children to whatever school in the area they want to send their children to. And that's the voucher system. One of the big issues was Medicare. Oh. I mean, one of the strong things going for Gore, where he won many senior citizen votes, was that he was going to provide for senior citizens the cost of prescription, remember, prescription drugs, the whole thing. That was a very, very big issue and difference. One of the biggest differences had to do with taxation. There has been, over the several years, this incredible surplus. And the question was what to do with the surplus. And Bush had suggested, well, what we need to do, since we have more money than we really need, is to cut taxes. And that will stimulate the economy. But the Democrats came back and said very rightly, who needs to stimulate the economy? It's in great condition. Oh. So now that leaves Bush with something. Somebody handed him a declining economy. Oh. One of the differences, of course, has to do with environment. I'm talking next week about the Middle East. The major vested interest of the United States in the Middle East is oil. And in fact, one of the great threats to our economy is the rising price of oil. Oh. Well, the way to solve the problem partially is there may be, within the territory of the United States of America, huge reservoirs of oil that we have not tapped, which would lessen our dependence on foreigners who wish to do us harm. One of those places may be, up in northern Alaska. That became a very big issue. The environmentalists screaming, never, no, no, never. Well, we'll see what Bush's intentions are by appointments that he has made. One of the disagreements obviously had to do with, yes, we're all in favor of improving the life of ethnic groups, deprived ethnic groups. But for the Republicans, there is no affirmative action. No affirmative action. No affirmative action. And for the Democrats, although it has been greatly modified, there's obviously the opening to the possibility of affirmative action. The last one, which defines one of the most controversial issues between Democrats and Republicans, between the religious right and the rest of the country, has to do with lifestyle. And the two flags of lifestyle for the elections are always abortion and gay rights, right? Aren't those the two? Abortion and gay rights, abortion and gay rights. And in fact, when one talks about improving the climate of human rights, whatever, the Republicans and Democrats have very, very opposite points of view with regard to that. Now, during the election, there were certain critical developments that I just want to mention them because they're important for what may happen in the future. One of the key figures was McCain of Arizona. My feeling was that had he been the candidate for the Republican Party, most likely they would have won clearly. McCain, I think, would have garnered large numbers of votes, would have taken them away from the Democratic Party, people who are in that independent sector, who are not what I call traditionally Republican or traditionally Democratic. It may not have worked in central South Carolina, but it would have worked in Michigan. But he lost. One of the critical times was the entry, obviously, of Ralph Nader into the electoral process. One of the critical times in the election was the arrival of Lieberman. The choice of Lieberman by Gore as his vice presidential candidate actually fired up the Democrats. Gore was sort of, going down. It was the convention and the choice of Lieberman that for a while gave a kind of surge which did not last forever. One of the critical points in the election, which was very bad for Gore, was the debates. He went into the debates, and everybody, even the Republicans said, don't take them seriously, he's just a better debater. Now, Bush as a debater, everybody knew, would be a disaster. But quite frankly, in the encounter with Gore, Gore proved to be inadequate. He was a huge and crushing disappointment, and it was in the debates that one could perceive that he was going to have a much tougher time than many people thought initially after the Lieberman surge, remember that, in terms of his encounter with Bush. One of the critical developments, of course, was the great attempt on the part of black leadership to bring out the black vote. It happened in Florida. Lots and lots of people who were not familiar with the whole balloting procedure were suddenly what? Thrust into a voting system where, in fact, the procedure for selecting the candidate was technologically, mechanically inadequate. But the reason why Gore maybe took Florida once they count the votes is because of that black surge. And obviously the final critical development was the ending up of the election in the courts and the determination of the election ultimately by the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Now, right now is the beginning of 2001, and whoever becomes the President of the United States lives in certain realities. So let me describe the realities. They're different from what they were 2 months ago. The first reality, George Bush is now the President of the United States, and what he has is not a buoyant economy. He has a declining economy in crisis. I mean, Alan Greenspan intervened and there was a surge in the stock market, but do you understand that the issue is there going to be a hard landing or a soft landing? Coincident with the arrival of the new president is the fact that in Europe, things are vastly improving. And in fact, what is very clear is, I was in Europe between my last lecture and now, all right, and it's very clear there's a whole new mood. Europe is being reorganized with all the complaints and troubles. Rising to hegemonic power in Europe is now Germany. The French are grumbling and mumbling. The British are grumbling and mumbling a little bit. But what is happening is that the European economy, which was in a deep funk, is beginning to pick itself up as the American economy is going down. And Europeans now seem to be more reluctant to accept, with their newfound unity, complete and full direction anymore from the United States of America. So how you deal with Europe as a rising power that we've always seen as an ally but not as a competitor is going to be one of the major issues of the next 4 years. One of the coincidental developments is this crisis in the Middle East, which could lead to a major war. And the United States, as the hegemonic power in the world, would have to respond to that. It's 10 years after the father of our current almost president, brought the United States of America, and I thought appropriately, into the Gulf War to punish Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And the last development is very interesting. It's partly related to the anti-missile program. There is now developing a kind of coalition of rejected states who are now trying to develop an anti-American agenda. One of the leaders of this coalition is a man you may not know about. I'm going to spend a lecture on him. He is the new leader in Venezuela. His name is Chavez. He does not like the United States of America. We get a lot of our oil from Venezuela now. They have huge reservoirs of oil. Chavez likes Fidel Castro and Saddam Hussein. And in fact, they've now sort of gotten together as a kind of an informal coalition, and playing footsie with them is the leader of a power that's now trying to assert itself in some way, having lost its imperial luster. And that's Mr. Putin, the president of Russia. Oh. Politics, international affairs are always interesting. We're at a time now of change when we need somebody at the helm who is going to be what? No, I'll tell you, it's superbly talented. The provocations are overwhelming. The economy is declining. Foreign affairs provide what? Real challenges and opportunities. So we have questions, don't we? The question is, given all these challenges, does George Bush have the ability to deal with them and cope with them, or to arrange to deal with them and cope with them? What kind of management style will he develop in order to deal with these provocations? What kinds of policies will he develop, both economic and in terms of foreign policy? What will he develop in order to respond to these provocations? Will he, in an almost evenly divided Congress, or with an almost evenly divided Congress, will he be able to build coalitions which will be necessary in order to get whatever his policy legislation is through? And all of that is accompanied by these fears. I mean, the publicity certainly generated by the opposition to George Bush was that this man is an intellectual lightweight. A lazy man who certainly does not have the ability to deal with the challenges we're now facing. And now we're adding another challenge, not only the foreign policy challenges, but also the challenge of the economy. So the question is, what will this new president be like? Come back in 5 minutes and I'll tell you as much as I know. All right. Now I want to look at the new president who has to face the challenges. And one of the things we need to do is, in order to be objective, is to recover from what I call the intensity of partisan bitterness that prevents us from in any way, shape, or form identifying with the with the other side. We begin to exaggerate differences to the point where we can't concede any virtues to the other side, and that happens both on the Democratic and Republican side. The President of the United States will be, on January the 20th, will be George W. Bush. And he will be the president of everybody in the United States of America. And what I'm going to try to do is to point out the challenges that he faces. One, and even Republicans will admit it, he's intellectually limited. By the way, that is not necessarily a total defect, because some of the most intellectual people I know could not manage anything. Cannot manage anything. What we want from the president is not simply one who can sit down at the soiree and prove himself to be the star. We need a good manager, right? But he is intellectually limited. His interests in life have never lent themselves to what we would call the intellectual. I can think of dozens of people in my life who weren't very good at schoolwork, who went out to become incredible managers and leaders of organizations and whatever. So this sometimes is an inappropriate snobbery that we engage in. The second is, and you can tell it from his schedule. His enemies say lazy, I use the word leisurely. He likes large amounts of leisure. He has a ranch he goes back to. There are places he goes back to. He's not a workaholic. He's not the kind of person who gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning and then off to the office and he's working all day. That is not his schedule, and it is highly unlikely, with the exception of possible brain surgery or whatever. It's not his lifestyle is not going to appreciably change. Third, and it's of interest in terms of foreign policy, he did learn Spanish, but that was because he was in Texas. He hasn't traveled very much anywhere in the world. I mean, he doesn't like to travel or hasn't traveled. His awareness of what is happening outside the United States of America from personal and direct experience is very limited. His father, on the other hand, had long experience in the diplomatic world, and his grandfather. He has the challenge of legitimacy. That is, it's one thing to win the election with a clear and powerful majority, right? And so even if your enemies hate you, well, they won. But what he's always struggling against is this thing that won't go away, namely that if they'd only counted those votes in Florida right, he would not have been the president of the United States of America. And so he's always struggling with the legitimacy issue, which I don't think will go away. It will keep popping up whenever people get very angry at him. I mean, his major challenge is his Congress. He's got this evenly divided Congress. And in fact, among the Republicans, there are Republican moderates who might even be classified as Republican liberals who could easily, switch over to the other side. He doesn't have enough depth to control Congress. And so he can come up with whatever legislation he wants to. He's going to have trouble getting through his agenda because he no longer has a large body of conservative Democrats he can pull over to the Republican side. They vanished with the takeover of the South by the Republican Party. And one of his major challenges has to do with the Republican leadership in Congress. Whether it's DeLay or Trent Lott or whoever it is, the Republican leadership in Congress is deeply partisan. Many of them are what I would call the alumni of the Newt Gingrich victory in 1994. And the Republican leadership in Congress is still the same leadership that tried to impeach and ultimately convict Bill Clinton. And so this is not a leadership that is prone to make the kinds of compromises that coalition building might require. That is, he has to be strong enough, that's the challenge, to rein them in. Otherwise, he can't get the votes he needs. In fact, the Republican leadership in Congress was deeply wounded by what happened in the impeachment proceedings. They had invested their pride in what? In impeaching, and they succeeded in impeaching, right? And convicting Bill Clinton. And they failed. So, now what are his advantages? For people who are determined to dislike him, they can see no advantages, but one has to be objective. When you look at his track record on the whole, the way he works with people, whether in Texas or otherwise, he basically has operated as a moderate, not as what I would call a hardline conservative. Not like DeLay, not in the House, not like Trent Lott, right? He has not operated that way at all. And in fact, he's done a lot of coalition building himself in Texas. There are lots of Democratic legislators in Texas who swear by him, who think he's terrific, who think he's wonderful, cooperate with him. So the track record of the Bush family is not that they belong to the conservative edge of the Republican Party. In fact, there was a time when Bush wanted to be president initially, but he couldn't because he was viewed as what? His father, as too liberal for the leadership of the Republican Party. They wanted somebody much more conservative, Reagan. The second is that he has a history of building coalitions, and that will have to be demonstrated on the federal level. It was demonstrated on the state level. In fact, he reached out into the Hispanic community, something that the Republican Party had not been really willing to do, and he did it. He reached out into this constituency, and he won support. 27% of that constituency supported George Bush. The third thing which is good is because he's not very intellectual, he's not an ideologue. Sometimes you get people who are very intellectual who have these intense ideologies. And so intense that they can only serve a limited number of people who agree with them. Bush has what I would call certain cliched phrases that he uses from time to time that sound conservative, but on the whole he's no ideologue. His history has been that he wants to survive politically. And so I don't see him as a person who will press extremist Republican agendas, especially of that of the religious right, because he is in power. One of his advantages is, very good, his pride is not hurt if he delegates power to somebody who's very powerful and talented. Some very, very brilliant people can't delegate any authority.
Now,
charismatic. That's not Bush's problem. Bush most likely would be grateful. No, but it's an advantage. Do you understand? If he himself does not possess all the qualities required and information required to deal with all the problems, then what a good manager does, and by the way, there are lots of very successful managers in the world who themselves are not that well informed, but they find the right people. They always find the right people to do the job. And certainly he has a history of being able to delegate. He has two very brilliant people around him. One to help him is certainly Alan Greenspan. And one of the advantages is this man called Dick Cheney. Obviously, Dick Cheney has a conservative record in terms of his political stances that may seem more conservative than moderates would approve. On the other hand, nobody can deny his smarts and his managerial skills, certainly when he was the Secretary of Defense under Bush and the prosecution of the Gulf War. And something is happening now, and you can see it happening, which may change the course of American history. Up until about 20 years ago, the worst job in the world was to be Vice President of the United States of America. Most people didn't even know the name of their Vice President. I remember I grew up with one man from Texas by the name of John Nance Garner. I mean, he was much better off as the Speaker of the House than he was as a do-nothing Vice President. Roosevelt didn't give him anything to do. Now that changed. In the Reagan administration, it's interesting, the Vice President now appeared to be as the heir apparent. It already happened back in the Eisenhower administration with Nixon. There's a new role for the Vice President. The Vice President is the President in training. Oh, that's a whole new vision. That also happened under Clinton with Gore. But it wasn't quite clear what the job would be. Now, a new office is being created. It's called the Prime Minister. The king is the president, and the king has a what? A prime minister. The prime minister does the management, and there's no doubt about it, in the Bush administration, and it may not be all bad because he's competent. A managerial figure will be there whose name is Dick Cheney, and he, as the prime minister, will report to the king on occasion, or hopefully frequently, whatever it be, and he manages, he runs things. Now, once you establish through custom a role, then often it tends to what? It tends to continue. It may be a redefining of the role of the Vice President. And one of his advantages, and I recognize what a brilliant and effective president in many respects Bill Clinton was. One of his advantages is that although Hillary will be in the Senate, the whole Clinton craziness, do you understand? Which also included to some degree Gore, no matter how he tried to separate himself from it. It's all what? It's gone. We're into the beginning of the 21st century. It's a kind of new era. Now, if he's going to need people to delegate things to, if his subordinates are going to be as important as he, then those subordinates are what? Very, very important. So recently he picked a team rather quickly, right? Most people start November 7th or 8th. I mean, he couldn't supposedly start until the middle of December, but he came up with a team which is, in many respects, amazing. The Republicans were famous for ethnic uniformity. All members of the cabinet were white, Anglo-Saxon males. Got it? So I want to just look at this, this cabinet, which theoretically includes 14 secretaries, but you could also add the National Security Advisor, the Environmental Protection Agency head, and a few others who basically constitute the inner circle, which will serve as the cabinet, the Privy Council of George Bush. There are two blacks. I mean, the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, right? A black, and Ron Page, who was appointed as the Secretary of Education coming from the school system of Houston, is a black. And then this very brilliant woman, whether you agree with her or don't agree with her, who came out of Stanford, Condoleezza Rice, right? She's the National Security Advisor. It's three. Women. I mean, everybody complain about the anti-feminist attitudes of the Republican administration, so there you are. I mean, he appointed Christine Whitman, the governor of New Jersey, to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. There's Ann Veneman, who is also the Secretary of Agriculture. There is Gail Norton, who is the what? The Secretary of the Interior. His chief policy or spokesperson advisor is this woman by the name of Karen Hughes. They're all together. There are, if you added them all up, there are 5 women that are involved in the inner circle who have significant power. He's got, and there's Linda Chavez, who is the Secretary of Labor. And you look at the pictures of the cabinet, there are all these women, blacks, and then he has at least 2 Hispanics that are there. There's Linda Chavez, who is the Secretary of Labor, and there is Mike Martinez, who is the Secretary of Housing. This looks like a Democratic cabinet. And when I say Democratic, I mean its ethnic diversity reminds you of something the Democrats started going all the way back to President Roosevelt. And then he chose an Arab American. I do want to say, and I did not vote for Spencer Abraham. No. But I could see the trouble he was having. Many of the people who voted against him didn't vote against him for ideological reasons. They voted against him because they didn't want an Arab to be the senator from the state of Michigan. The very way his ads went. Big Spencer Abraham. So, he has now been appointed to the cabinet as the Secretary of Energy. By the way, it's slightly ironic since he had proposed a bill in Congress to abolish the office of the Secretary of Energy, saying it was useless. But, you know, this proves my political principle that you can always adjust principles to your what? To your vested interest. No, it's the whole thing, okay? And the third figure is a man by the name of Gonzalez, who is the main press secretary for Bush, a man who came out of Texas. In terms of Hispanic, one Arab is Spencer Abraham, and one Japanese, the man who was just appointed as the Secretary of Transportation. His name is Mineta. He came out of, he's a Democrat. In fact, he was just serving in a Democratic administration, and he was moved over to the Bush administration. He's a Democrat. Says he's a Democrat. And you got one Italian, Principe, who is now the Secretary of Veteran Affairs. You look at this thing, if you were doing what I would call an inter-ethnic, interfaith banquet, got it? You would pick yourself the Bush cabinet. If you're talking about affirmative action, you see, that's what's so interesting in America. Even the people who denounce affirmative action have to practice it. In the end, you have to have so many women, what? So many Hispanics, so many blacks, whatever. And whether you're Democratic or Republican, it doesn't make any difference. The first thing you notice about the Bush team is it's what? It's incredible diversity. Now, you obviously have in the Bush team some old-timers. By old-timers, I mean people who worked in Republican administrations from before. That's not necessarily a defect. That may be an advantage. They have what? Experience. We go back all the way to President Ford. We have this man called Donald Rumsfeld. Oh, yes. He was a young man. He was only 43. I think he's 68 now. It happens in life. No. He was with President Ford, and here he is now Secretary of Defense of Paul O'Neill, who is the Secretary of the Treasury. He worked under Nixon. He was in the Budget Department under Nixon. So what I'm saying is a lot of these people had experience before, some old-timers. We have, by the way, some defeated politicians. One is the defeated Republican candidate for the Senate and the incumbent in Missouri by the name of John Ashcroft and Spencer. Two defeated candidates for Senate are now in the cabinet. And what we have is a mixture of moderates and conservatives. So let me just go through the list of his team. The team is crucial because after all, this team is going to be doing a large part of the management under the Prime Minister. The king is W. The Prime Minister is Dick Cheney. And then under the Prime Minister is what we call this now, among the moderates, and when I say moderate, basically, when I say moderate, I mean people who, one, are not attached to the religious right. All right, what defines you as a Republican moderate is that you are not attached to the religious right, and what makes you a moderate also is that you can see virtue in your opposition. Extremists can see no virtue in their opponents. Their opponents are all what? Wicked, evil, terrible. Ooh. Well, Colin Powell, Secretary of State, actually he's quite a distinguished choice. Some people have concerns about his reticence in terms of taking military action. He was around at the time of the Gulf War. He was in charge of the whole military. He had advised against the intervention, but he went ahead and managed it despite his reservation. But it's very clear. Did I only put one L in there? Oh. All right. That Colin Powell sometimes I get diverted. That Colin Powell is on the moderate side. This is no old-time Republican conservative. Like Eisenhower, at one time, people thought they could get him for the what? Remember? For the Democratic Party. O'Neill, who comes out of Alcoa, a very, very effective manager of a major corporation. He's much admired even by many of the Democrats. Kind of a no-nonsense administrator who took a company that was failing and transformed it into, again, a very, very successful and powerful corporation who enjoys the admiration of Greenspan, of Alan Greenspan. By the way, O'Neill told Newt Gingrich off. He felt Newt Gingrich didn't know what he was talking about when he started talking about eliminating all the entitlements. O'Neill's a pragmatic guy. He wants to get things done. He doesn't understand what he calls extremist ideology. Ann Veneman, the Secretary of Agriculture, we don't know that much about her, thought of as a moderate. Evans, who was a fundraiser for Bush in Texas and a close friend, moderate. Ron Page, the black educator from Houston, a moderate. And Christine Whitman from New Jersey, we all know her, right? She was the liberal Republican, now in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. So there are lots of what? Moderates on this team. But then there are also some people who are undoubtedly conservative. So let me mention who they are. One, a man very closely allied to the religious right, who is a Pentecostal Christian. His name is John Ashcroft, and he is the former senator from the state of Missouri, who just barely lost the election to the widow of his opponent. It was a bizarre election in Missouri because his opponent died in the middle of the election. Ashcroft, who is now the Attorney General, he replaces Janet Reno. And there are many people who had strong reservations about Reno, and now they feel that this man, who was an ultra-right-winger with strong opposition to abortion, to gay rights, and to what many people view as the human rights agenda, will now be the Attorney General. In the Department of Energy is the man who wanted to get rid of it, is Spencer Abraham, who certainly wants to cultivate and to exploit whatever resources are available to make the United States more self-sufficient. And attached to him is a very conservative woman from Colorado, who was the Secretary of the Interior. Her name is Gail Norton. And Gail Norton is one of those people who believes that, yes, one should protect the environment, but on the other hand, one should not, in protecting the environment, undermine the strength and power of the United States of America. So she certainly has expressed herself openly in favor of developing oil resources in northern Alaska. So this is viewed as a conservative appointment. Another woman is Linda Chavez, who is not a very popular figure in the Hispanic community, because she has come out against both affirmative action and against bilingual education. In fact, her program is something that liberals used to endorse, which is if you come to America, what you do is become an American. To become an American is to spend your time learning and speaking English. You can't become an American all the time by speaking Spanish in the schools and whatever. Therefore, she's very much in favor of what we call the Americanization program. And everybody should stand up as an individual man or woman, Hispanic, black or white, and be judged on the basis of his or her own merit. There used to be liberal what? Liberal credentials, but now she's viewed very much as an arch conservative. And then there's a figure who has mixed credentials. That's Tommy Thompson, who has strong opposition to abortion in the state of Wisconsin, but on the other hand, he was responsible for welfare reform in the state of Wisconsin, which didn't end up simply with poor people being thrown off of welfare rolls. It was a very, very creative program in which large sums of money were spent by the state to provide for employment training and the readmission of people into the workforce. It was a very creative program. Even liberals had to admit that Thompson did pretty well. So was Thompson a conservative? Is Thompson a moderate? Well, what happens with labels is they don't always work. You may be moderate on one issue, but what? Conservative on another. Now, what are the implications of these choices? Well, I think the advice that was given to Bush by Cheney and by his inner circle was that in order for him to have any momentum in this presidency, given how tight the race was, the only way for him to get any kind of momentum is to present himself as a strong leader with a program of his own. That if he starts off by saying, don't get excited, I'm not going to bother you, whatever. If that may be a Naderite protesting my failure to bring them into the discussion. Appearing too moderate or too wishy-washy would prevent him from having any kind of image or momentum. That is, the idea is it's better for Bush to have a strong program which may have popular appeal, which may be rejected by the Congress, and then he can appeal over the heads of the Congress to the American people in the next election, as opposed to having a kind of nothing program, trying to please everybody. So what he's decided to do is basically to carry out his campaign platform. Even though he didn't get a majority of the votes, he's coming on strong. And the reason he's able to come on strong is obviously he's delegated a lot of the work to strong people. One of the implications is that the Republican Party is now wedded to ethnic diversity. One of the constituencies I know that the Republicans are going to try to break into, because their future depends, given the comparative birth rates in this country, depends on their breaking into other ethnic groups than Anglo-Saxon groups. One of the groups they've already penetrated fairly successfully are the Hispanics, well represented in the cabinet. And now they're also going to turn to a group that has offered great resistance. But they feel that there's a rising bourgeoisie in this group that might be amenable to Republican politics, and that is the black community. And now blacks are going to have, is one of the major leaders of this administration, the man who's always going to be talking about foreign policy more than Bush will be Colin Powell. One of the things for sure is that George Bush is now saying, you thought my tax cut didn't mean anything. I told you all the time that Clinton was presiding over a failing economy. And now the only way to stimulate the economy is to cut taxes. Now Greenspan's alternative is what? To lower the interest rates, and that may be a better way to do it, but let me predict. Bush is going to push for his tax cut, and that's going to be a way for him to say, you see, I'm a strong leader, I keep my word, I go through with what I say. Now, whether he can get that tax cut through the Congress is another matter. He may have to rely totally on Greenspan to adjust the what? The interest rates to make for the soft landing. One of the implications is, one of the first things he will do, so that he has some kind of presence other than the tax cut proposal, is an education initiative. And that education initiative will exclude something that would ruin the success of the legislation. Bush is going to have to drop vouchers for a while, because including that into any kind of education initiative will be to doom it in terms of a Congress so evenly divided. But there will be some kind of education initiative, most likely providing funds for the education of children in the inner city, whether it's the improvement of teachers, the lessening of the size of classroom, whatever it be. There will be an education initiative, because that's part of the image he wishes to create. One of the implications is very clear, that Dick Cheney is going to be the most powerful vice president the United States has seen, because he is going to be the prime minister. And there is no doubt that he has the intellectual power to carry out the job. One of the implications is, and this is part of the conservative agenda, our job is, according to the conservative agenda, our job is not to remake the world. Our job is to defend American vested interests. American vested interests lies obviously in the cultivation of free enterprise all over the world and the emergence of democratic regimes, but it also rests in our containment of dangerous countries. We don't coddle them. So contain who? Well, you've got to contain them. They are Saddam Hussein of Iraq. Certainly maybe the government of North Korea. Certainly the fanatic governments that lie in the Muslim world. Certainly the overreaching power of China. Certainly on the conservative agenda is the defense of what we call the integrity of Taiwan. So containment simply means that your focus is on making sure that troublemakers aren't able to make trouble. Now, when we talk about the crisis in the Middle East, one of the factors, of course, one of the questions that arises is, where does American vested interest lie in making deals with all the Arab countries, or in utilizing Arab countries, moderate Arab countries, and even Israel in the containment of what we call Middle Eastern dictators like Saddam Hussein? And remember, the president is the son of George Bush, who invested his prestige in the Gulf War. One of the implications is going to be oil exploration. Now, whether an almost democratic Congress would in the end approve this, I don't know, but obviously I think with Gail Norton as Secretary of the Interior that there will be areas of Alaska that will now be open to oil exploration. One of the things that will happen under the Bush administration will be the giving of public money to religious organizations to provide services, counseling services, health services to needy and to poor people or middle-aged people. It's happened in the state of Michigan under the Engler administration. That is, one of the ways, classically, that welfare was provided was that the state created an agency. The secondary way is that the state provides the money, but the state then designates private associations to do the work. And certainly under the Democrats, the institutions that were chosen tended to be secular, but certainly under Engler and most likely under Bush, I think more and more of them will be with religious orientation. One of the implications is we're going to have some battles over the courts. I assume that over the next 4 years there will be at least 1 or 2 people who will retire from the Supreme Court of the United States, including Rehnquist. And that will create a battle. My gut feeling is that the Republican leadership, together with Bush, will try to have a conservative person placed on the court, and that will provide the court battle. And one of the things that will persist, given the agenda that has been chosen, is that there will be a lot of partisan bitterness. And that's been demonstrated by the fact that the Republican leadership in both the Senate and the House, in making committee appointments, do not wish to be generous to the Democrats, creating a certain level of resentment. So the issue for Bush is the following, and there's the next 100 days. Can he put together a stellar team with a strong message that can go out in the next 100 days and create for him the image of what? Being a strong and effective leader. And even if he meets resistance in the Congress, he now has an excuse for his program not being implemented, because what? He's got these people resisting him, and therefore in 2 years they have to be what? Removed. It's a bold program. I mean, it's a risk. But what's the alternative? The alternative for Bush is mush, is being nowhere. And being nowhere for him politically is, in the end, to turn over the next election to the Democrats. So there's going to be a lot of what I call very, very bitter partisanship. But what is most interesting is the developments that I see happening. One, I think Al Gore is on his way out. I mean, 4 more years, Gore, please. I hope not. He almost made it, but he what? But he didn't. And it's very, very clear that if the Democrats have another chance to pick somebody, they ought to pick somebody who is more effective as a spokesperson for the party. They need somebody more charismatic. The second thing is one of the stars is going to give Bush apoplexy. Is going to be this woman who bought this huge house in Washington, having sold her old big house in New York, which she had, hung on to for only a short while. Her name is Hillary Clinton. And she is ambitious, if you talk about an ambitious woman. And one of the star spokespersons for the Democratic point of view is going to be through the mouth of Hillary Clinton. Now, initially, she's going to try to be laid back. It won't last for long. No. It's not in her nature. She's going to be there, and already there's speculation that she might be the what? A candidate in 4 years or 8 years for the presidency of the United States. The third thing that's going to happen, there is going to be legislation for voting reform. The Electoral College, there'll be proposals to amend the Constitution. They will not pass, I assure you. But there will be proposals that will pass because in the end, it is very clear to most of the American public that something needs to be done to prevent the kinds of fiascos that occurred during the last election. There will be the redistribution of seats as a result of the census, which is going to shift more power into what I call the new states, Florida and Texas and California. Now, Florida and California are always up for grabs. Florida more Republican than Democratic, California now more Democratic than Republican, unless the Republicans can really penetrate the Hispanic vote. But there's now going to be a shift. The areas of the country that went for Bush in both the South and the West, many areas are going to have more what? More representation. And one of the developments is, and it's independent of Democrats and Republicans, it simply indicates why you can say that the politics of America lies in the center. Whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, we're going to have ethnic and gender diversity. No doubt about it. The day when you could live with the other is gone. It's over. And one of the things we're now going to encounter, which is sometimes very disturbing for liberals, is there are going to be large numbers of blacks, Hispanics, and even women who achieve leadership, who will articulate conservative points. See, there's Linda Chavez. She ought to be a feminist. Well, she is. She's I'm a feminist, but no affirmative act. Do you understand? So what's happening in America, which is part of the Americanization process of ethnics, part of the Americanization process is that you can be not only a liberal, you can also be a what? You can also be a conservative. And this is changing the politics of the United States of America. But I do want to say something. All over the world, we live with countries in which there is such ethnic, do you understand? Anti-feminist hostility. And there's plenty of it in this country. But I do want to tell you, looking at the Bush cabinet, no matter whether we have tax cuts, don't have tax cuts, whatever it be, when I look at that cabinet, it's very reassuring to me. We live in a country that works, where ultimately ethnic groups are brought into the mainstream of politics, and where in the end they can make a choice. They can make a choice to be either liberal or conservative. And so, like you, I wait in suspense for the next 100 days. And I hope he never has to use the word subliminal. Thank you very, very much.